Welcome, dreamy time travelers. Perhaps you're now ready to go to sleep. Or maybe you just want something soothing in the background while you fold your laundry or contemplate your next romantic mistake. Either way, you're in the right place. Tonight, we'll wander through the soft, candlelit corridors of history to uncover the strange, slow, and sometimes scandalous ways people dated before the world went to war. In this episode, we're diving deep into how people found love, or at least a marriage contract, before the world turned upside down. No apps, no emojis, just courtship dances, sweaty love letters, and heartbreak by handwritten note. From stiff ballroom dances to scandalous handholding. This is the awkward, adorable, occasionally outrageous history of dating before World War I. So fluff your pillows, dim the lights, and prepare to fall asleep to the untold lives of people who flirted, fumbled, and fell in love in corsets and cravats. Chapter 1. Courtship in the Georgian and Regency era. Welcome to the world of powdered wigs, empire waistlines, and courtship rituals that make modern dating apps look like chaotic freedom festivals. Here, love isn't something you find. It's something your parents negotiate. Back in the Georgian and Regency eras, dating was more like applying for a very exclusive job where the position was husband and the qualifications were land, income, and an acceptable number of teeth. There were no dates, no dinner, and a movie, no texting you up. The entire idea of getting to know someone casually was scandalous. Instead, you danced supervised. You spoke barely. You locked eyes across a room and hoped no one fainted. If a gentleman fancied a lady, he didn't slide into her DMs. He slid a sealed letter through her footman. Love letters were the 18th century equivalent of emotional skywriting. And if she liked it, she responded. If she didn't, silence. Or worse, her mother wrote back, formally. When words failed, the fan spoke. No, really. There was a whole fan language system, like Morse code with lace. Fan over right cheek means yes. Fan over left cheek means no. Open and shut rapidly. You're too close, sir. Dropped fan. Oops. Flirting initiated. Of course, this all required interpretation. And interpretation often meant embarrassment. So let's say you're a well-bred young lady in the 18th century, and a gentleman with a halfway decent jawline has taken an interest in you. Here's how that romantic roller coaster is supposed to go, assuming no one dies of consumption midway. Step 1. The first glance. He sees you at a dinner party. You see him. Your eyes meet across a roast goose. Scandalous. Step 2. The introduction. He can't just walk up to you. He needs a proper introduction. Through a chaperoned third party who confirms he's not a criminal, or worse, middle class. Step 3. The social visits begin. He starts paying visits, never alone. Always with someone old and nosy sitting 5 feet away. He talks about the weather. You pretend to care. Step 4. Subtle gifts, subtler signals. He might send flowers, or a poem, or a handkerchief embroidered with the emotional equivalent of a vague thumbs up. You, in turn, might accidentally drop your glove and let him pick it up. Romantic, right? Step 5. Family involvement and interrogation. Your parents get involved. They ask him questions about land, lineage, and whether he plays an instrument badly, preferably because too much talent is suspicious. Step 6. The proposal. After weeks or months of zero physical contact and lots of passive-aggressive parlor chats, he asks your father for permission to propose. If approved, you're engaged. If not, back to goose glancing. Step 7. The engagement. Now you can. Hold hands, occasionally, and only if no one else is in the room. Wedding planning begins, complete with 10 pounds of lace and a cake no one likes. Step 8. The wedding. You tie the knot surrounded by doilies, dowries, distant cousins you've never met. You still don't really know each other. But hey, you're legally allowed to touch now. Congratulations. And that, dear time travelers, is how romance happened in the 1700s. Very slowly, very politely, and almost entirely supervised. If you kissed before marriage, you were either deeply in love or deeply unemployed. But was it romantic? Sometimes. Many couples learn to love each other after marriage, like a slow burn fanfiction, but in real life, with corsets. They weren't looking for a spark. They were looking for stability. But once in a while, when the right words landed, when the right glance was shared, the spark found them. Chapter 2. Victorian Era Dating, 1837 to 1901. Ah, the Victorian era, where women wore 20 pounds of fabric. Men had sideburns that could support wildlife. And romance was basically a polite negotiation held in a doily-covered room. In this chapter, we enter the most anxious era of dating, full of rituals, rules, lace, and letters that could kill a relationship with a single misplaced semicolon. If a gentleman was interested in a lady, he didn't start with a text. He began with a calling card. Think of it as Tinder. If Tinder involved printing expensive cardstock and handing it to a butler. If she kept it, promising. If she returned it. You've been ghosted Victorian style. If she accepted your card, you could call, but not unannounced. You showed up at her family's house during calling hours, aka 2-hour windows, designed specifically to kill chemistry. You were expected to sit, chat, not touch anything, and occasionally compliment the wallpaper. Feeling bold? Then you wrote. Love letters in the Victorian era were no joke. They were heartfelt, grammatically correct, and sometimes longer than modern dissertations. And if the feelings were mutual, she replied with equal poetry, and maybe a pressed flower if you were lucky. If you were mourning a loved one, you wore black for months, sometimes years, and during that time, romantic activity was frowned upon. But, and this is very Victorian, mourning also created romantic openings. If someone wrote you a condolence letter, that was sort of a vibe. The Victorians wrote everything down, including how to love. Etiquette guides offered helpful advice, like a lady. must never display unguarded enthusiasm. An ankle must remain a mystery. A gentleman must never compliment a woman's hat without also mentioning the weather. In short, be in love, but do it quietly, preferably from the next room. If all went well, cards exchanged, letters sent, parents convinced, you might get engaged. But beware, in Victorian society, engagements were public news, and breaking one off could ruin a woman's reputation forever. Getting dumped was bad, but getting dumped publicly, fatal. Victorian love was tender, poetic, and wrapped in 1,000 rules. But as steam powered across the country and telegram wires lit up the sky, love got louder, faster, and just a little more unhinged. Chapter 3. Industrial Lira, dating 1850s, 1880s. As factories roared and cities swelled, romance squeezed itself between 12-hour shifts and 6-day work weeks. Industrial era dating wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and sometimes that made it even more beautiful. Imagine falling in love over the sound of clanging metal and the smell of grease. Welcome to romance. Industrial Edition. Flirting happened during lunch breaks, water fetching, or moments behind the machinery. Workers invented subtle signals, dropped handkerchiefs, shared tools, smuggled notes inside sandwich wrappers. And of course, if your supervisor found out, you were fired. But if you were lucky, you'd end up married, probably with 7 kids and 0 money. Working-class couples often couldn't date publicly, so letters were passed via siblings, co-workers, or tucked behind bricks in shared buildings. Industries brought men and women together, but also across class boundaries. A factory girl might fall for a young clerk. A coal miner might secretly love a boarding house girl, but love across the labor divide, still frowned upon, still spicy. Most young workers lived in boarding houses. That meant tight quarters, nosy landladies, and constant supervision. But it also meant romantic opportunities in the most mundane places, like sharing a boiled potato or fighting over laundry slots. Industrial Lira dating wasn't about champagne and opera. It was about street performers, public dancing, puppet shows, and if you had a few pennies, moving pictures. And even if your feet were sore and your collar smelled like coal, you still found ways to smile. Love didn't care about soot or status. It showed up anyway. But as cities grew and technology accelerated, romance got even faster, louder, and occasionally electrified. Chapter 4. Rural versus Urban Romance, mid to late 1800s. In the late 1800s, your love life depended on geography. In the countryside, you married your neighbor. In the city, you flirted with someone who sold you gloves. Different vibes. Same confusion. Out in the sticks, love was slow. You didn't need a lot of strategy. You just needed to help bale hay, show up to the barn dance, and not be a jerk. Common romantic acts. Walking her home for 5 miles, sharing firewood and admiring her butter churning technique. If someone knew how to fix a fence and was Protestant, you married them. That was the algorithm. In cities, love was louder and more crowded. People met in shops, on streetcars, at photography studios. You could see someone every day and never know their name. Flirtation zones, department stores, train stations, ice cream parlors, and telegraph counters. With better mail delivery and rail systems, lovers could write more often, multiple letters a day. If you were bold, love moved faster, and sometimes fell apart faster too. Cheap romance novels gave young readers unrealistic expectations. Forbidden kisses, runaway brides, and handsome blacksmiths with secret pasts. Rural romance was about stability. Urban romance, possibility. Neither was perfect, but both got people to the altar, eventually. Now that people could send messages faster than a sneeze, romance was about to get shocking, literally. Chapter 5. Telegraph, Trains, and Trouble. From 1870s to 1900s. By the late 1800s, love was picking up speed. Literally, trains, telegrams, and long-distance longing were changing the rules. Now you could meet someone in one city, fall in love in another, and get dumped across state lines. Before there was texting, there was telegraphing, and it was expensive. Every word counted. Every punctuation mark cost money. Romance had to be efficient and slightly cryptic. Basically, it was romantic Twitter if Twitter charged per character and made you stand in line at a dusty office. The invention of railroads meant long-distance lovers could now visit. A young man could hop on a train and show up at your town, assuming he wasn't derailed, delayed, or eaten by a bad sandwich. Train stations became emotional battlegrounds. Departures were full of tears. Arrivals were full of hope. And if a couple eloped, better believe it happened on a night train. With speed came scandal. Some couples ran away to get married. No permission, no dowries, just love and a train ticket. This created full-on societal chaos. Parents panicked, communities gossiped, newspapers printed names. Sometimes they chased the couple with telegrams mid-trip. With more women joining the workforce, especially in telegraphy and typing, new romances were brewing in offices. You know what they say, nothing bonds. People like proximity and paper cuts. Romance was still frowned upon, especially if it interfered with productivity or if the boss found out, but it happened. A lot. Mechanical music players, like gramophones, meant that couples could now bond over shared tastes. She liked Liszt, he liked Chopin. They both swooned to melancholy string quartets in parlor rooms, creating moody playlists before it was cool. And as electricity lit up cities, romantic walks at night got spicier. Technology made love faster, but it also made hearts more fragile. Because with every train ride, every telegram, came the risk of falling for someone who could disappear at the next station. Chapter 6. Dating and Class. How Money and Status Shaped Romance. In the pre-World War era, your dating options weren't just limited by your charm or jawline. They were limited by class. The Victorian way of saying, "We like you, but not your salary." Rich people didn't just fall in love. They performed. Love, every look, every gesture, every invitation was part of a high-stakes negotiation wrapped in lace and parental control. Debutante balls, basically TikTok premieres, but with corsets, matchmaking moms, ruthless, elite, armed with monocles and emotional blackmail, suitors checklist, wealth, land, lineage, and zero scandals, bonus points for owning a horse. Meanwhile, in the factories and fields, romance was less about empire and more about survival. Working-class couples met at markets, on factory shifts, or in the queue for water. There was no time for subtlety. If he liked you, he'd walk you home. If she liked you, she'd let him. Now, imagine dating while living at work. That was the reality for servants, maids, cooks, footmen, who were expected to be invisible and celibate. Spoiler, they were neither. Forbidden romances between staff members, or worse, between staff and employers, were tabloid gold. Or, street gossip. Sometimes, a wealthy man fell for a poor girl. Sometimes, a lady gave her heart to a man with a scandalously low income. Most of the time, this ended with heartbreak, exile, or a very long boat ride. But every so often, once in a blue blood moon, those stories turned real. Even couples within the same class had to calculate. Did his job offer security? Did her family have debt? Could they afford rent and love? In a world without financial safety nets, romance didn't just involve hearts. It involved spreadsheets, metaphorically. Class dictated who you loved, how you loved, and whether that love could survive the ledger book. But change was coming. Women were marching. Men were being drafted. And suddenly, love had no choice but to evolve. Chapter 7. Dating on the Eve of War. From 1900s to 1914. In the final years before the world went to war, dating was caught in a strange in-between. Women were fighting for rights. Men were preparing for war. And in the middle of it all, people were still trying to fall in love. She marched for the vote. He just wanted a picnic. Suddenly, the woman you were courting might also throw bricks at Parliament on weekends. Political awareness became a factor in flirtation. If you disagreed about women's rights, you probably weren't compatible, unless you liked arguing. In that case, soulmates. As corsets loosened and hemlines slightly rose, flirtation became a little more open, a little more physical. In co-ed, men and women talked at social clubs. They danced without gloves. Sometimes they even held hands. On purpose, but make no mistake, society still had rules. Only now more people were ignoring them. By 1912, war drums were pounding suddenly. Romantic relationships had a timer on them. Every flirtation felt more urgent. Every kiss had a question mark. Will he come back? Will she wait? Many couples rushed into engagement before deployment. Some married in a whirlwind of uniforms and promises. Others just kissed and hoped. As Europe tensed, long-distance love was once again the default. But now, letters traveled to trenches, postcards crossed borders, and emotional ink stained thousands of pages. These weren't poems. These were lifelines. And then some made the ultimate decision. Why wait? Why wonder? They married before the war began, sometimes just days before shipping out. These were fast loves, often fragile, often real. Chapter 8. Dating disasters they couldn't write home about because heartbreak, humiliation, and misfired letters existed long before blue ticks and ghosting. Not every love story ended in a poem and a happily ever after. Some ended in spectacular, social ruin. Some never even got started. And some just limped away quietly, like a one-legged goose at a garden party. Let's take a moment to peek at the awkward side of pre-modern romance, when the wrong flower meant heartbreak, when a love letter got handed to the wrong sister, and when being too forward could haunt your social standing longer than a syphilis diagnosis. Yes, it was that serious. Imagine this. A gentleman caller leaves his carefully printed calling card, only to realize he left it at the neighbor's house by mistake. The scandal, the confusion, the aunt thinking she's being courted, the daughter crying in the back parlor, the mother drafting invitations to a wedding that's not even real. One little rectangle of cardstock mass hysteria. Then there was the infamous incident of the misdelivered love letter. He meant to write to Miss Eleanor, but he wrote to Miss Elizabeth. They were sisters, and they were not amused. Miss Elizabeth thought she was engaged. Miss Eleanor challenged him to a duel of etiquette. Their mother wept into her. Embroidery hoop, in short, handwritten confessions were romantic, but only if your penmanship wasn't a public hazard. Balls and dances were prime matchmaking opportunities, but they were also fertile ground for public embarrassment, like the time a young man tripped on a hem, crashed into a duchess, and accidentally proposed to her daughter with his face in her bosom. He was never invited back. The duchess fainted, and the daughter. She still brings it up in her memoirs. One overly confident suitor once spent an hour reciting poetry to what he believed was his beloved standing at the end of the hallway. It was a mirror. She had left the room 5 minutes in. He was passionately describing her eyes to a reflection of himself, and he only realized it when her actual father came up behind him and said, "She's in the conservatory, my boy. You're wooing the coat rack." And finally, there was the gentleman who showed up for tea, with a marriage contract in his coat pocket. He proposed during the first cup. She declined during the second. He fainted into the third. Sometimes love can't wait, but maybe, just maybe, it should have. So, the next time you send a risky text or walk into the wrong Zoom date, remember, you're not alone. Romantic disasters are as old as powdered wigs and corset stays. Somewhere, someone in 1792 also whispered, well, that could have gone better. Chapter 9. Rural Romance, River Walks, and Rotten Apples. Courtship in the countryside, where love was seasonal, literal, and occasionally involved goats. While city lovers were dancing at balls and mixing metaphors in telegrams, their country cousins were falling in love the old-fashioned way. Through chores, through sweat, through a mutual appreciation of turnip quality. In the countryside, dating didn't always come with candles or lace, but it did come with long glances over fence posts and accidental bumps at harvest festivals. Let's step into the fields, forests, and farmers' markets of historical rural romance. In many villages, the local orchard was more than a fruit source. It was the unofficial Tinder of the 1800s. You'd walk with someone between the rows, talk about the weather, pass them the best-looking apple. Boom. Married, of course. If they handed you a wormy one, it was basically a public breakup. The riverbank was another classic courtship spot. A couple would stroll slowly along the path, pretending not to touch elbows, while someone's aunt trailed behind them like a disappointed spy. No kissing, no hand-holding, but if you skipped a rock, for her, and it landed smoothly, that was practically a proposal. Rural courtship picnics were less about wine and roses, and more about cold potatoes and hoping it wouldn't rain. But if he brought fresh bread, and if she packed extra jam, that was foreplay. They'd sit in the grass, talk about who just married, whom, and accidentally brush fingers while passing the butter. Romantic opportunities often came disguised as errands, like the livestock market, where you could compliment someone's goat and start a 3-month flirtation. I like your pig was not a pickup line, it was the pickup line. And if they let you hold the chicken, wedding bells, baby. And then there was the barn dance, the Super Bowl of rural romance, hay on the floor, fiddles in the air, and exactly 2 candles lighting the entire space. If someone danced with you more than twice, you were either getting engaged or starting a scandal that would outlive your grandchildren. At the end of the night, he'd walk her halfway home, because all the way would be too forward. They'd pause at the gate. She'd say, "Good night, then." He'd say, "Aye, nothing more, nothing less." But both would stay up all night, remembering how close their boots had been. Rural love wasn't rushed. It moved at the speed of planting, growing, and waiting for the harvest. But when it bloomed deep, and you could always tell when someone was in love, because they'd bring the good apples. Chapter 10. Scammers, suitors, and sketchy proposals. Romance wasn't always sweet. Sometimes it was shady. Welcome to the historical prequel to catfishing. Not every suitor came with good intentions. Some came with forged titles. Some came with fake mustaches. Some came with 12 aliases and a habit of proposing to multiple women on the same afternoon In a time before credit checks, phone calls, or criminal background searches, romance was a little bit magical and a whole lot risky. Let's dive into the darkly entertaining side of historical dating, the scams, schemes, and slippery sweet-talkers of the pre-war past. In 1883, a man known as Count Frederico von Something arrived in Bath, England, tall, elegant, and suspiciously vague. He proposed to 3 women in 1 month. He promised estates, titles, and a carriage lined with velvet. He actually lived in a boarding house over a butcher shop. When he vanished, all he left behind was a silver button and a trail of angry fiancés. Sometimes the proposal was the red flag. One woman in 1905 received a ring inside a raw potato. His note said, "Like this spud, our love has roots." She fled. Rightfully, others weren't so lucky. Runaway brides were a real thing with some women, escaping out bedroom windows, hopping trains, and starting new lives under different names. Because sometimes, till death do us part, felt less like a vow and more like a threat. Letter writing was the peak of romance, but it was also the peak of romantic fraud. Some men used beautiful penmanship to woo rich widows. Some women wrote poetic declarations, only to ask for a small loan to help my dear brother by paragraph. 3. If you fell in love by mail, there was always a chance you were actually in love with someone's landlord, trying to pay rent. In rural France, there was a woman who buried 4 husbands, each richer than the last. People called her la veuve charmante, the charming widow. She claimed they all died of fainting fits. Locals claimed she cooked a suspiciously good mushroom stew. Did she scam them? Did she seduce them? Was it love or long-game inheritance planning? We'll never know. But her garden flourished. Not all scams were criminal. Some were just exaggerated performances. Men rented coats they couldn't afford. Women borrowed jewelry for just one party. You didn't have to be rich. You just had to look rich until someone married you. Then you'd both find out the truth. Sometimes in church. In that sense, historical dating wasn't so different from today. For every great love story in history, there was a tale of deception, disaster, or a potato ring proposal. So if you've ever fallen for the wrong person, been ghosted after 3 dates, or thought someone was the one because they owned a trench coat and read poetry, you're in excellent company. History is full of people who fell hard. Sometimes for love, sometimes for a lie, and sometimes just flat on the ballroom floor. And so, dear time traveler, we leave behind the scandalous suitors, the orchard glances, the riverbank heartbreaks, and the mystery of the potato proposal, romance before the world. Went to war wasn't always poetic. Sometimes it was confusing, awkward, hilarious, and very itchy if you were wearing wool. But whether it came from a ballroom or a barn, a handwritten note or a half-baked lie, it still had that spark, that very human, very hopeful belief. Somewhere out there, someone might walk you halfway home and say, "I," at just the right moment. So whether you're still awake or already halfway through a dream, Thank you for spending a quiet hour with Maine, the soft shadows of love stories past. If you enjoyed this slow drift through history, I'd be honored if you joined us again. There are more eras waiting, more whispers from the past, and more tales of people just like you who hoped, who flirted, who fumbled, and who felt. So until our next sleepy journey, stay curious, stay cozy, and as always, good night.